It does have a tendency to whirl. Is it live?
Yeah.
All right. Hey, good evening, Nebraska. This is Rod Moeller with the Nebraska Firearm Owners Association. I'm down in Lincoln, and joining me this evening is Dr. William Aprill.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
You betcha. Hey, so the reason you're here is you're giving your class Unthinkable Tomorrow, right?
That's right.
Tell us what Unthinkable actually is.
Well, it's a long walk down a dark road, as I sometimes say. It got started with a discussion I had with some friends of mine who are trainers in this space, and we were concerned that folks were thinking a lot about things that were, in our minds, putting the cart before the horse. How to shoot, things like that. That's very easy to find coursework about. But that there were a lot of things that were going unaddressed because they're not much fun to think about. One of those is the nature of criminal violence and the nature of the people that do it. And so over the course of a couple of years, we built a course that really lets us get at the methods that dangerous violent criminals use to choose who they're going to be aggressive against, and their psychosocial development, how they become who they are.
Now, I was first exposed to some of your material at the Rangemaster Tactical Conference several years ago. Mm-hmm. I think you gave a presentation, which is a portion of this class, mm-hmm. called thin slicing. Mm-hmm. I thought that was just really eye-opening information.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts of our own minds that are hidden from us. But there's a real benefit to understanding what they are, because if you have a better operator's manual, so to speak, you can avoid certain pitfalls that are really dangerous. And thin slicing cuts both ways. Very rapid decisions are made both by us in crisis situations, but about us too, meaning the bad guys are using the same hardware and the same software to make decisions. And if we can understand how their decisions work, we can sort of reverse engineer responses to them.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. So tell me a little bit about your background. You have a doctorate in, what is it, criminal psychology?
No, it's funny. I got here the long way around the barn. My first graduate training is in social work, of all things.
Okay.
Yeah, and then in psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is the psychology of practice in this case a very kind of old-fashioned school of what we call depth-oriented psychology. I guess most people would think of it as a little bit like psychoanalysis, much longer term. But I was a sheriff's deputy in my youth, and so I sort of found myself in spaces where mental health systems and court systems overlap. They overlap quite a bit. And so not a forensic psychologist, not at all. That's a very specific subdiscipline. I'm a clinician, but I've done a lot of forensic work. Okay. Evaluations for criminal cases and things like that. And I worked in law enforcement myself. So I just found myself in this odd area where they overlap. And it's always just sort of suited me.
Okay. So working with the sheriff's office is how you kind of came to decide where you wanted to go professionally then. Huh?
My very first exposure to criminals was as a regular old sheriff's deputy working in one of the worst jails in America, very violent place full of tons and tons of violent offenders. And what I found out, which was really interesting, was that jail, even more than it's frightening, is boring. And everyone there is bored. The staff is bored, and I guarantee the inmates are bored. And they're so bored that they'll actually talk to the staff. And if you pay attention, sometimes they'll tell you the truth. Wow. And some of what they tell you is really illuminating. It took me quite a good while to build a framework where the textbook knowledge, so to speak, about criminal behavior and the practical knowledge that I actually gained from criminals fit together. But I hope that's what, part of what gets conveyed in the class is to help somebody get the fruits of that process without having to spend 20 years doing it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find it much easier to spend a day than a career.
And, as long as people are willing to sort of, come in with an open mind, there's I think quite a bit to be learned in this class because, a great deal of what we think we know about violent crime just isn't true. And some of the beliefs we have aren't really founded in anything other than that we believe them. And so it's important to get up to, as I like to say, to catch up to the speed of the game.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, prior to seeing your stuff, I'd read some books from Rory Miller and some other folks who oddly also spent time working in Department of Corrections. So that seems to be a common background to really help understand that criminal mind.
Yeah, corrections is sort of the dark underbelly of law enforcement. I mean, there's nothing glamorous about it, but it's a kind of concentrated criminality, and there's an awful lot of exploitation and violence that goes on, but in a very concentrated setting. Both concentrated in terms of just space,
sure.
But also there's so much criminal interaction because just about every interaction that happens in a jail is between two felons. And so the learning opportunities, if you're taking them, are double.
So who do you see as the primary audience for Unthinkable?
I always say people with something to lose.
That's almost everybody.
Yep. Folks that have an interest in protecting themselves and other people that are important to them. It's important that we do it well because it matters. It really matters. And
so it's not just really concealed carry permit holders or people that defend themselves potentially with a gun in their home. It's really anybody, particularly maybe people that don't carry.
That's one of my favorite audiences and one that I really try to get to come to class. Like I said, the only barrier to entry in my mind is an interest in protection of yourself and others. I don't presume that anyone is going to be there because they carry a gun. And they certainly shouldn't be there or not be there based on that alone. Far from it. If you're interested in protecting yourself and others from violent crime, from criminal exploitation of any kind, then it's a class for you. It's not going to be the kind of class where you're sort of shamed if you're not a gun person. Far from it. Some of the most egregious mistakes people will make in class are made by gun people. One of the real benefits of people not having a firm position on where they stand in terms of, what am I going to do to protect myself? Would I think about carrying a gun? Is they haven't made a lot of the mistakes yet. And so if they can, like I say, get their minds up to the speed of the game as part of that decision process, they can avoid a lot of mistakes and wasted time.
So your company is Aprill Risk Consulting. Is that just for the training aspect, or what is your current employment? I mean, are you contracted by an entity, or are you employed by an entity? Are you predominantly a consultant, or what?
No, I'm on the mental health side. I'm a solo private practitioner. I don't work for agencies anymore. The VA, honestly, killed me of my ability to work for agencies. That was it.
Really?
Yeah, that's a whole other story. But
were you employed by the VA for a while?
I did. I worked on the chronic mental health side at the VA, and that just firmly convinced me that I really am not suited to work for other people. And so on the mental health side, I'm a solo private practitioner. And in terms of training and consulting, that's what Aprill Risk Consulting does, is we do training and consulting all over the place about 40 times a year.
Okay.
That's for agencies, governmental agencies, private security firms, but a lot of it is open enrollment public coursework, quite a bit of it.
Okay. So what's your typical week like?
I see patients during the week and do this on the weekend.
Okay.
That's the kind of most typical week for me is, my practice is about 30% folks with addictive disorders, because that was where I got my start working in addictions. And so about 30% people with addictive disorders and their families, about 30% folks with PTSD, specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder for a good while. And then the rest is a general mental health practice. People with depression or bipolar disease or even serious mental illness like schizophrenia.
Okay.
And then on the weeks, training and consulting in places like scenic Lincoln.
Yeah. And you've been to Nebraska a few times.
I have, quite a few. And I quite like it, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're lucky that you came when we're no longer in the single digits.
I know. Luckily, you're having a bit of a warm snap, but for Louisiana, this would be panic-inducing cold. People would be running around in the streets.
Yeah, things are a bit different down south.
It's true.
So you're you've been living in New Orleans for several years. Are you born and raised in Louisiana as well?
Yeah. I'm a Louisiana native, though I went to college and then graduate school in the Northeast.
Okay.
But I'm a Louisiana native, and I've been back since goodness, the late '90s.
Okay.
I came back, and I've been in New Orleans ever since.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my first exposure to you was during one of the Rangemaster Tactical Conferences. You're definitely part of the Rangemaster family.
Sure.
How long have you been part of that family?
Well, I started out attending the Rangemaster Conference years ago, and it came up at some point. Tom Givens, the principal of Rangemaster, he had asked me if I would repeat a block that I had given for the Masad Ayub at that point of Lethal Force Institute, and now of Masad Ayub Group. I had been teaching about post-traumatic stress disorder for mass at some of his more advanced courses. And Tom asked me if I would present on post-traumatic stress disorder, basically giving a recap of the same talk.
Okay.
Because there's a very specific subset of PTSD that involves post-shooting trauma, meaning folks that have had to engage, a dangerous, violent criminal. Even if they win, so to speak, there can still be a great cost.
Sure.
Being forced to shoot someone to save your own life is decidedly traumatic.
Difficult to reconcile, I'm sure.
Well,
for a lot
yeah,
of folks.
but also it's truly a moral affront. I mean, you are not to put too fine a point on it. The closest analogy to being forced to use violence to save yourself, the closest analogy is to sexual assault. You're being forced to do something that's sort of morally repugnant to save yourself something worse.
Right.
The only reason you're using violence against someone is because if you don't, you'll die. And that's tremendously traumatic for a lot of people. More so if they haven't sort of, as I put it, neatened up their side of the street beforehand. It's pretty important to reach moral certainty with a lot of these kinds of decisions well before they're called upon.
Right. Yeah, it is.
Uncertainty is uncertainty, especially in the face of overwhelming fear of death, is very traumatic. And we don't want to do injury to ourselves if we don't have to.
Absolutely not. And since then, you actually do the occasional class. It's kind of a trifecta. William Aprill and Tom Givens and
Craig Douglas.
Yeah. How often how long have you been doing that together? And how often do you do that? Just a couple of times a year?
We just do that once a year.
Once a year.
And that class is in January. And it's a class called Establishing a Dominance Paradigm. And that is, that's a pretty intense class. That's 30 to 35 hours over 3 days, three very full days.
35 hours, that's long days.
There's a lot of classroom mostly about human performance under stress. There are some very demanding courses of fire shooting. And then there are live action force-on-force scenarios that require a tremendous amount of decision-making under stress. These are real world events, not all of which involve violence, but all of which involve a kind of crisis. And so it tests the student's ability to process information quickly and make life-saving decisions quickly. And if they don't, they'll pay the consequences that in the moment feel quite real.
Wow.
Most people think that they'll know that it's a game, so to speak. But that's not the case at all. We get full-on adrenal responses. The body doesn't recognize kinds of stress. To the body, stress is stress. It doesn't recognize that a game, unquote, isn't real. And so the force-on-force training is as close as you can get to a real life-threatening situation without being involved in a real life-threatening situation. So it's a very stressful and demanding course, but the gains students make are worth it, and they certainly justify the effort.
Wow. How did that come about? I mean, were you guys just enjoying some drinks and conversation after one of the days at Tactical Conference and kind of came up with the idea that, hey, let's get together and create something bigger?
Yeah, as we were sitting around at some point talking about courses that would be fun to teach, we thought about this kind of course, a course that would take people from an academic understanding of how the brain works under stress to scenarios that would force them to live in that reality. And as we sort of bantered back and forth, it dawned on us that we could actually do it. We could actually do this course, and it would actually, would appeal to a very specific subset of students. Students that are pretty darn serious, because it's quite a bit of investment in terms of travel and time and cost, and willingness to undergo some pretty stressful training, and it appeals to a certain kind of student, a very serious student, and it's tons of fun to teach very serious students.
Sure. Yeah, it seems like one of the issues we face in the training community is, everyone wants to take a beginning class and maybe get their concealed carry permit. If then maybe they have to take a class for that, depending on what state they're in. But being willing to go to that next level of training and continue on seems diminishing number of folks that are willing to commit to that type of training.
It's a real conundrum for the training industry, because untrained people defend themselves and save their own lives every day all over this country. People with no training of any kind, but that doesn't mean that's what we should aim for. Right. That's certainly not an ideal circumstance. But the funny thing is, there tends to be almost a reverse payoff. There seems to be a sort of reality tax, if you will, that once people have trained a little, their performance actually gets worse than if they hadn't trained at all, until they've trained enough that their performance improves. A well-trained, someone who's interested in protecting themselves and others, and who's well-trained, can handle the kind of stress we're talking about and can survive and thrive in really very adverse circumstances. But it's tough to get people to fight through the learning curve. There are tons of people who'll say with a straight face, I've been around guns my whole life. I don't, what are you going to teach me that I don't already know? And it's a kind of literal ignorance. They just don't know what they don't know. They don't know that they're missing certain capacities, certain skills. And hopefully, what I find, one of the favorable outcomes of especially the course Unthinkable is that I've had people say, wow, if this is the makeup of the kind of people who will commit violent crime, I really need to up my game. Because, as I often say, we're not going to be visited with new skills at midnight on the corner of State and Main. Right. When a crisis event happens, it's a come as you are affair. And so what we want to do is get ready enough and skilled enough and competent enough that even when our capacities degrade under stress, we're still good enough. Right.
Yeah, it seems fortunate that, so many instances where a gun needs to be used to defend oneself that, over 99% of the time, a shot isn't even necessary to be fired. So I think that's a testament to a lot of people, at least keeping their composure enough to not overreact and shoot when it's not necessary. But it doesn't really, bring a great understanding as to what type of stress you're going to be under when you have that.
True.
And just because you're very accomplished at the range in a non-stress situation doesn't mean you're prepared to deal with a violent criminal actor at the time.
No, the analogy I make is we've all taken driver's ed. We had to at some point. We took a driver's ed course. That doesn't mean we could survive and thrive in an Indy car in a race. In a race, I'd be the most dangerous driver on the track. I would likely, cause a wreck that would take out half the cars. Yes, I've taken driver's ed. Yes, I can operate a car. That doesn't mean I can do it at the highest level under great stress. And thinking you can is a kind of arrogance that sometimes people don't know they're practicing until it's too late.
or even other emergency maneuvers. You know, I mean, the more common, you know, avoiding an accident, you know.
Sure. Evasive driving is a skill, you know?
Yeah, you may have been told, well, here's what you would have to do, but you rarely have that opportunity to practice something like that in a driving course.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, you know, CPR. Maybe you had to take a course once 10 years ago, but you haven't kept up on any of that knowledge. Somewhere back in your mind, there's a mental file marked CPR, and some elements of it, you know, you can recall, but hoping that they'll rise to the surface under stress. Whoa, that's a very high stakes bid.
I'm pounding on the chest of a real body versus you know, a dummy in a classroom is very different.
Yeah, and you know, especially what we got to keep in mind is that this is not a rare or unusual outcome. There are millions of violent crimes committed in this country every year, and every single one of them is an opportunity for someone to defend themselves.
Right.
Every single violent crime could have been defended against. I mean, the most common defensive gun use is simply presenting the firearm. The presence of the firearm itself is dissuasive. There's a famous line that there's a pretty fair number of bad guys who just want to see your gun. And once they see that you have one, they find something else to do. But the ones that we're even more worried about are the ones where it doesn't dissuade them.
Right.
Because the only thing that will stop that person is the ability to use force. Harsh language isn't going to do it, and the fear of getting hurt isn't going to do it. At some point, we may very well run into that subset of violent criminal offender where the only thing that works is defensive violence.
Well, so many of them have been raised in an environment where violence is just the norm. So violence to them is nothing, where to a lot of us, that's not something we've had much exposure to. So it's a much more serious prospect for us. So what we would think is a certain level of force, they may brush off.
The vast majority of nice people will never be involved in a violent confrontation, and that's good, not bad. But that doesn't mean that we can guarantee we won't.
Right.
I think the CPR analogy is quite good. The vast majority of us will never need to use it, but it would be awfully nice if we did know how, and if we did have basic familiarity with it for that one moment, because there are some occasions that call for a very specific kind of intervention, and nothing else will do the trick.
Right.
I often say that a gun is a lot like a parachute. When it's necessary, if you don't have it, you'll never need anything else again.
True. So I know the next thing I'm going to talk about is a lot of times more state by state specific, but I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are with your background on the current state of Department of Corrections and criminal reform. I mean, thoughts on that kind of topic of.
Well, incarceration is a blunt instrument, right? And I'd like to think that that there's some good that could come out of the fiscal crises that a lot of states find themselves in. There are tons and tons of people in jail and prison all over the United States who have no business being there. And we're getting to the point now where we can't keep them all. We just can't afford it. Keeping someone incarcerated for a year is a matter of spending dozens of thousands of dollars per person. And when you've got 2.5 million people locked up, we're getting to the point where we can't afford that. And so we've got to get smarter about who do we keep in jail, because letting them take part in normal society is just too risky. And that we need to conserve the resources by using a much smarter approach to other kinds of crimes, lifestyle crimes. The number of people that are, you frequently hear the complaint that the jails are full of nonviolent drug offenders. Well, federal prisons are, but on the state level, it's violent criminals.
Right.
There are plenty of violent criminals locked up in state prisons. And so it's at the state prison level that We have to be even smarter because we need the resources that are available for those serious violent offenders. I think there are lots of other options. And especially when it comes time to think about risk assessment, we've got to be much, much smarter about risk assessment. Bail. We've got to be much, much smarter about bail. Bail isn't a punishment, right? And the point of bail isn't to keep people in jail. It's to assure that they show up for court.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a jail full of people who can't afford bail is an unbelievable waste of money. Not to mention the fact that it costs them their jobs.
Right.
What we want is not unemployed people in jail, but if someone does, I'm thinking of kind of simple possession of marijuana, right? Hardly the crime of the century. But even in sort of modest cases, it's not uncommon to see bails in the amount of thousands of dollars, and people simply can't come up with that.
Mm-hmm.
But is that a good use of that money? As a taxpayer, you are a consumer of those services, and do you feel like you're getting the most bang for your buck? I don't think so. So we've got to be a lot smarter on the corrections front, because we're running out of resources to just do blanket mass incarceration. It's just, it's not smart.
One of the challenges that we're facing in Nebraska is what we call good time. So they earn good time, meaning early release. Pretty much, they earn a day of early release for every day that they serve. So if you have a 10-year sentence, you're guaranteed to not serve more than 5 years. In fact, we had somebody that recently escaped prison, and I think he's going to lose 30 days for having escaped. And that's something that's frustrating to watch the legislature struggle with, is, trying to figure out, do we give them automatic, or does it have to be earned?
Sentencing is another place where obviously we can get much better at it and much smarter. I'm old enough that I was actually involved in the federal law enforcement system when there was a Sentencing Reform Act way back when, in the late 80s, early 90s. And the federal guidelines came to pass, and those are fairly controversial, here and there. But one thing that did work is that federal sentences became much shorter, but you served them. There's always been the strange discount effect of people will be sentenced to hundreds of years in jail, but will be eligible for parole after 7.
Right.
And it's what strikes me about that is kind of silly, is that the long sentence makes for great PR. It looks good in the newspaper. So-and-so sentenced to 285 years in prison. But I think we need to get more realistic about sentencing. There are some folks who can be rehabilitated. There are some folks who can't. That they're not willing to make the kinds of changes, personal changes, that would ensure that they're not going to recidivate. So figuring out who's who and making sentences suitable to that sort of thing strikes me as much, much smarter use of our dollars.
Sure. Well, and I think there needs to be an evaluation of how people go about getting enrolled in some of those programs too. From some of the corrections folks that I've talked to, it sounds like everybody participates in one of these programs because they just know that it's beneficial to them to do so, but not for the stated reason or the objective of the program. It's 99% of them have no interest in the program itself. So trying to find a way to, tailor this so that there's no incentive to go beyond what the program itself is.
I had a fairly long-term patient who was in the Marshal Service Witness Security Program. And when I met him, he was 49 years old. And from age 13 to age 49, he had spent a total of 2 years out of prison. He was extraordinarily successful inside prison. He was a pretty high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang. So he was sort of a celebrity inside the prison system. But outside the prison system, he was completely non-functional as a person. He was a heroin addict and a bank robber and a gang member. I mean, he just was unable to function in the sort of larger world until he got his addiction under control. And in working with him, we got him on a opioid replacement therapy. He got, off heroin for the first time since he was 13 years old, and suddenly he's a different person. So that, the consequences of substance use disorders, of substance dependence and substance abuse in the correctional system is huge. Locking people up because of their addiction and the behavior associated with their addiction is just about insane. It's a little bit like locking someone up in prison because they have cancer and keeping them locked up until they stop growing tumors. If you have an untreated addict in and out of prison, he's going to be committing the same crimes that put him in prison.
Sure.
And
if
so,
you don't treat the actual issue.
And so getting serious about that is something that I think about, because about half of incarcerated people meet criteria for one or more substance use disorders. It's extraordinarily common. And there's no shortage of drugs of abuse in correctional settings. And so, that's something that we've got to get real about. People take lots and lots of positions on substance abuse, but addiction is something I think we can all come together about. We've just got to start having a more grown-up discussion about what it means to be addicted, and what it doesn't mean is that you're lazy.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about what addiction really is.
And when it leads so directly to so much incarceration and so much recidivism, we have to start thinking about it just in terms of of reducing the cost, reducing the drag on our society of incarcerating people who have a problem that's amenable to treatment, not amenable to incarceration.
Right. And the difference in cost is dramatic.
For every dollar spent on treatment saves 5 at least spent on incarceration. And that's, we're getting to the point where the pile of dollars is not only shrinking in real terms, but we want to use it on something else.
Mm-hmm.
There are other things we could be doing with these billions of dollars rather than pouring them into the same hole over and over and over again.
Yeah. William, I really appreciate you spending the evening with us, doing the video. Before we end, Patricia, do we have any questions that have come up?
There were 2 questions that came through social media. The first one is, when it comes to all the discussion that happens in the media that we see all the time, every time there's an active killer event, those kinds of things, they love to emphasize the need for more mental health. When do you think had we ever had enough assets with regards to mental health? And when was that change? And what would you recommend we bring back?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we actually gone very far afield into my other interest, which I like quite a bit. States used to have large state mental hospitals. There were every state in the union had several large mental hospitals, and folks by and large who were seriously mentally ill checked into those hospitals and stayed there for the rest of their lives. There wasn't much treatment available, so they were mostly given sort of compassionate care. But some kind of unusual things happened in the 50s, right? The class of drugs called the major tranquilizers were developed, and some of them had tremendous effect, life-changing effect on people with serious mental illness like schizophrenia. Now, some of these hospitals were snake pits. There's no covering that up. They were awful places to be. And so there was litigation aimed at getting people out. They said, look, these hospitals are terrible places. The conditions are not good. You have to let these people go. And so there was this pressure, mostly by the ACLU, to either heal them or let them go. That was basically the thrust of litigation. And there was in 1963 something called the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which basically said we want to empty out all these huge state hospitals and give people treatment in their community settings in small community-based mental health centers. Well, the problem is we did the first part, which is closing all the big state hospitals, but we didn't do the second part. We didn't build community mental health centers to treat these seriously mentally ill people. So they became homeless.
So this wasn't an idea that, hey, we have local facilities that could pick it up. it was an idea that, well, we could do that, and then they never followed through.
Well, we sort of promised to, and then didn't. We sort of created a crisis by closing the large state mental hospitals. I don't know where it is in Nebraska, but there are massive hospitals in state hospitals in every state sitting empty now, because we just don't do that anymore. There really aren't long-term state hospital options available anymore, but we didn't build the thing that was supposed to replace them on the community level. You know, the notion that with much more effective medication and community-based treatment, where people can be in as much freedom as they can tolerate, basically. Well, if you don't have any community supports, they're stuck at home. Well, they're seriously mentally ill, which means their family members have to try and take care of them, and that's not good for anyone. And so a great number of these deinstitutionalized patients wound up homeless, which is why local jails are, in effect, mental hospitals. Because a homeless schizophrenic who gets arrested for trespassing because he's digging in a dumpster winds up in jail, which is a terrible place for him. He doesn't get any better. He's a drain on resources. It's just a disaster. But one thing I would like, gun people, so to speak, people that are interested in self-protection, is not to sound as silly about mental health as anti-gun people tend to sound about guns, right? Anti-gun people say sort of cartoon things like, if there weren't any guns, there wouldn't be any violence. Okay, well, that's something a third grader would say. We got to be smarter than that. But a lot of gun people, unquote, tend to say mass shootings aren't a gun problem, they're a mental health problem. There's a difference between mental illness and personality disorder. The seriously mentally ill are more likely to be the victims of violent crime than the perpetrators of violent crime. The folks who shoot up schools are usually not mentally ill, they're personality disordered, which is a whole different kettle of fish. And we've got to be much more honest about what kind of crisis we have. And so, the crisis of mass shooting is real. I mean, school shootings and things like that are a serious concern. But we can't lay them at the doorstep of mental health, not strictly. And so it's something we've got to think about. And it would be a long series of very hard discussions.
And I imagine a lot of people don't really understand that distinction. I mean, they would think they may be a subset of mental health versus, something that's actually different.
Believe me, I am entirely sympathetic, because I get this question all the time. I can't tell you how many times I've been emailed the following question. They're just crazy, right? And I get it. When serious criminal violence doesn't fit in a normal head. We just don't have a parking spot in our minds for this kind of behavior. Mm-hmm. And it's just all too easy to shrug our shoulders and say, well, I guess they're just crazy.
Well, I think that's why the term Unthinkable, the name of the seminar in the series, is so relevant. And it is literally that. We who would not be able to fathom processing the planning and execution of these behaviors, it's just quote unquote unthinkable.
Yeah.
We can't process it. It goes against our very grain, our very soul, whatever you want to refer it.
Yeah, the reason that was the title that I came up with is, a concept that we like to use all the time in a sort of a therapeutic relationship is that we have to drag things from the unconscious mind to the light of the conscious mind. We actually have to think about them right out in the open. We have to change things from unthinkable to thinkable. We have to think about these things, even though it's very unpleasant.
Sure.
And shortcut answers, like they're just crazy, they make us feel better, but they don't solve the problem.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of times we talk about root causes. And one of the other questions that we received was, for someone who's looking at our society from a generational lens, this person who says, things have just changed. We used to have firearms everywhere. I ordered them from the Sears catalog, had them in my truck, I think is what he said, when he went to school. Guns were normal, I think is what he said. And he said, now we're fighting for our rights to retain something that we had as common as our kitchenware. And yet there are others, or a larger proliferation, or is it just more visible that people are choosing to use this particular tool for violent crime?
Well, some of it is, there's a lot of threads that come together in, why things are different. One is that we all tend to kind of fall into nostalgia traps. The funny thing is, if you listen to people now, sort of the parody of the old, get off my lawn guy, is that kids these days are just, they're just terrible. Well, people have been saying that for thousands of years. I mean, you can find written accounts over 1,000 years old of people going, kids these days, I tell you, they're just terrible. So we've got
throwing their rocks and sticks around.
Yeah, we've got to, these kids in their wheel, who do they think they are? No, but we've also got to think about that kids these days in a lot of ways are like kids any days.
Right.
But a couple of things that I think are important. One, kids are coddled now. And part of coddling kids means they're separated from the consequences of actions. And so they don't often encounter real-world consequences for real-world things. And if shooting up a school is a hypothetical act, if you've never seen a gun go off, you think shooting up a school might be something that's just tons of fun and great, and you'll feel like a superhero. But let's say you've been exposed to guns from a very young age. You've been rabbit hunting with your grandfather, or you've been shooting in the back pasture, and you know exactly what a rabbit looks like when it's been shot. Then that's not abstract. It's concrete, that you know what pointing a gun at somebody and pressing the trigger would do. And so that adds that layer of unwillingness to do it, because most people aren't monsters. Most people aren't barbarians. And so separating kids from it actually makes it easier to do, because it's unreal until it's started. And there have been several interviews with school shooters where school shooters have said that they were shocked by how loud the gun was. And that's a pretty clear indication of how purely abstract what they were actually doing was until it got started, and then it's all too real and it's all too late.
Those are some difficult questions to answer, so thank you.
No, thank you.
It also seems like a lot of times by being coddled that they're being shielded from failure as well. So they don't know how to deal with failure when they.
Well, here's an interesting example that just crossed my mind. When my little nephew, he's not my little nephew anymore. He's a first-year student at RPI. But when my nephew Vincent was a little guy, we spent the day together, and we were sort of doing uncle time, which means we did all the fun stuff my sister wouldn't let him do. And we were under my house, and I had some old window sashes, and some of them still had some glass in them. And I noticed him looking at the glass, and some of it was broken. And I just had this feeling, he wants to break those. And I said, well, hey, Vincent, you want to break those windows with me? And he said, yeah. So we set him up against the fence, and I let him throw rocks at the pieces of glass that were left. And he picked up a rock and threw it at the glass. And when the glass shattered, he was stunned. He said, wow, it really broke. And what dawned on me is that he had never been allowed to break anything before. He had spent his life coming close to breaking something and having somebody, his mother or me or his grandmother, say, don't do that. So he didn't realize that once you threw the rock, the glass really broke, and it can't be unbroken. And so that's even a nice kid raised in a nice family is so distant from the actual consequences of a lot of actions that they didn't exist for him until that very moment. And I think that kind of thing, I think that does play a role in school shootings. Also, there's no getting around the fact that kids are more lonely and depressed than they've ever been. Surveys are very clear. Teenagers are more miserable in a lot of dimensions than they've ever been. And most of these, especially school shootings, are in effect ritual suicides. Other people die, but the shooter's intention is not to survive. They want to go out feeling superhuman, supremely powerful for the first, probably only time in their lives. So I've got to think of them more as suicides. It's a crisis of suicide and collateral damage that we have to think about.
Is social media part of that?
Yes. Social media makes kids feel terrible about themselves. It makes a lot of adults feel terrible about themselves.
Because it looks like everybody's posting all the happy shit, and then they're like, well, I don't have that. More so than the bullying. I mean, bullying is another aspect.
Yeah, there's a kind of misery that comes from comparing your inside to someone else's outside. If you feel stupid and lonely, and then you see on Instagram a curated image of somebody having fun, it's easy to compare your inside, which feels bad, to their outside, which looks great. But the problem is, it's artificial.
Right.
We don't know how that person feels on the inside. We don't even know if they were happy in that moment. It's easy to imagine that they were. So social media tends to make kids feel worse and worse and worse. I love this expression. I don't know if you guys have seen it. FOMO, the fear of missing out. People say, oh, well, look at that picture. Look at that person's Instagram picture. They were just in Ibiza, or they were just in Paris. What was I doing? I was raking leaves. Oh my God, I'm missing everything good. So social media makes a lot of people feel a lot worse about themselves, and for not much benefit.
Wow.
And that, I don't know if there's any easy answers to.
No, because it's like a lot of things. It's a good thing until it's a bad thing.
Right.
It's to sit here and say we should get rid of social media because it's all bad, that's ridiculous.
No, there's many good aspects to it.
But I often say a lot of things are good until they're bad. I mean, water is a good thing until right about here, and then it stops being good.
Well, I think one of the things as a parent that I did differently than how I was raised was I wanted to build resiliency in my children, which meant they needed to be exposed at age-appropriate challenges and failures, and then we would talk about those things and what they meant. And I think one of the things that helps me as a parent is trying to articulate to my kids about those facts. Those people, those are images, those are paintings, those are stories shared to often create a mirage.
Well, they're marketing more than anything else.
Yeah.
They're marketing for the image of me as a successful, happy, accomplished person.
Right. And they're just as deep and just as challenged and just as sad and all the different feelings all of us have. They have them too. It's just not on their story.
I think it's important to draw the distinction, especially for parents, between confidence and self-esteem. Confidence comes from competence. Competence comes from learning and repetition, right? In order to be good at something, you actually have to do it enough that you get better at it. And then you feel you're competent, and that makes you feel confident. Self-esteem is something people try and sort of put on a kid like icing. I'm gonna cover you in self-esteem, and you'll feel good. But there's no confidence there because there's no competence there. Someone who feels good about themselves without a basis,
right?
They
it's
know.
Intangible and fleeting.
But moreover, the kid knows. I will never forget watching my little nephew, poor Vincent, keep calling him little nephew, throw away a trophy that he got at a soccer camp because he knew perfectly well that everybody got one, that it didn't mean anything. He got in the car and literally tossed it over his shoulder. That's not what we want trophies to mean. And kids are not stupid. And when they get unwarranted praise, they know it's hollow, and it actually undermines them. Because you're not telling them, hey, you're really good at this thing, and here's how I know it. You're telling them it doesn't matter if you're good at this thing. And so that's not a good message. So confidence and self-esteem are two different things, and I think it's important for parents to think about instilling one and not the other.
It's almost 10 o'clock.
Yeah, we've gone very far afield. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I look forward to the class tomorrow.
Oh, it's going to be great.
If you're watching tonight, we do have a few spots left. We'll accept cash and carry at the door up through 9 a.m. So, if you had been putting it off and thought it was too late, don't worry. We're going to have a great attendance, but we do have plenty of spots at this venue in Lincoln. So, hopefully you found this discussion valuable and interesting. And I look forward to the class tomorrow.
Come on out.
All right.
Good night, everyone.